So Matthew's left me to do the introduction. Surprise, surprise. So yeah, book, continuous delivery, making it work with Windows and .NET in particular. We all know about continuous delivery, that's why we're here. But this is particular with a Windows and .NET focus. I'm Chris, Matthew. So you were going to do this bit, weren't you? Why
yes, I thought it was worthwhile identifying why there was a special focus on Windows and .NET in the context of writing a book. Because the original book called Continuous Delivery came out in 2010, and we're writing in 2015, 2016. Today we'll run through some case studies as well, real-world things that are happening on a Windows platform with Continuous Delivery, and then there's some quite specific recommendations, some of which are sort of useful across different platforms, some of which are fairly specific to Windows, but still hopefully quite useful. So this is what the book cover looks like. And if you want to download it and give it to your friends, head to cdwithwindows.net and you'll get all the... these slides will be online later, by the way, but you'll be able to download it via that. That's who we are. Trying to think of some biographies that weren't too naff, but anyway, we left it with the ones we first came up with. What else? Is this... If you think about Windows and .NET around 2010, there wasn't really any automation, there was no package management. Some people would argue there still really isn't any package management, but that's a conversation for the pub afterwards. It's all very point and clicky. And kind of configuration of Windows systems was very driven by the kind of your SECM type systems which pushed configuration out, but themselves were very very closed systems, very difficult to collaborate on configuration for those kind of systems. Whereas, so it's, sorry, go on.
Oh yeah, that's a picture. The idea is every machine you create is handcrafted, specially made for the situation. It's beautiful. You spend time building this little thing. It's pretty. Go ahead.
But you can't reproduce it. So now in 2016, we've got PowerShell APIs for every Microsoft product. It's API first, and then a GUI comes later, which is a complete reversal of the traditional Microsoft way of doing things. We've got NuGet, which is fairly mature as far as it goes, Chocolatey, which is a bit less mature, and OneGet, which keeps getting renamed every few months, which is supposed to be a package management system, whatever that means. Anyway, there's some stuff there around package management, which is good. The Git experience, using Git as a version control system on Windows is now a proper, decent experience. It's not some half-assed thing, which arguably it was a few years ago. It feels like a proper version control tool to use. There's no reason not to use it. And there's loads of tools for configuring infrastructure. So infrastructure automation being a really crucial part of continuous delivery. All of the main tools now support Windows as a proper first-class thing, not just as a kind of port from Linux. Treat it as a first-class OS target. So the landscape is very, very different compared to just 5 years ago.
Oh yeah. So now all of your knitted creations are built to a pattern, automated. Every little scarf machine looks the same as every other machine. Much more reliable. Cool. Case studies. Ah yes. Okay. Speaker notes are slightly hidden. Wow, how did you work on this?
Where is it?
There we go. Cool. So this company called 7 Digital, they are a .NET-based, web-based music retailer, so MP3s, that kind of thing, without DRM. Also do streaming as well. So a lot of high use case, high data, all this kind of stuff. And they run their own servers, so no cloud or anything like that. And so lots of uses from this public API they've got, public and private API. So they've got keys and stuff, so there's lots of different things taking advantage of it. They also have user management, locker storage. So you get this platform, this API, web API platform of theirs is quite, it's quite complex, quite a lot of offering going on there. And like I say, it's Windows and .NET. And this is what their API looked like, say, 5 years ago. So one giant monolith for everyone working on it, one data store. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because that's hard to CD, as we all know. Especially hard CDs in something where .NET at the time, everything was kind of thinking about being a single application. You'd have a single, you'd write your Windows form app, and you'd put your Windows form out on the web, or your web forms app out on the web, and that's how it was. But we had trouble with CDing that, so we needed to break it down. So they tried to bring things out into more internal APIs, with teams focused on each of those. And this was a large change gradually done over a matter of years. And at the same time, there were things Microsoft were doing to make this easier for us. They were bringing out MVC, so it was testable, a lot easier around that. But still, server-side stuff's still pretty hard, but it's all gradual over time. And the way that they did this all with, without using branching. They did branch by abstraction behind the router, so the customers saw nothing, but they didn't use feature branching. So I'm bringing this in because, again, we're going back to CD and .NET, and they use Git and SVN, I think, at the time. SVN, Git, not Microsoft Technologies, something else that had to fill in that gap. And they would use one branch, and that was a release branch. Every commit was done into the master branch, but if they were doing a release, they'd take a snapshot. And it was just, I think it was an old habit more than anything else. They didn't need to take the snapshot, but every change was straight into there. And so just a forward single branch. And they have an automated release process development process they built up over time. We've already talked from Sean about TDD cycle. So they'd have this, and they'd commit direct into the master branch, which would kick off Team City's build and unit test. So Team City is a good part of CD that's coming later. And they use Octopus Deploy now to do the deployment onto the service. Again, a new feature, relatively new, to help with that deployment process of over in Windows and .NET. Because I remember before Octopus Deploy came in, they actually had a bunch of Ruby and Rake scripts to do the deployment. I think actually before that was Robocopy. As you can imagine, this is all kind of crufty, but what you could get away with. And now the tooling has come along a lot better and making this a lot easier. And the advantages to them is that there wasn't code sitting back here, not going out making customer money effectively, much like Sean was saying. It's not being proven. You're not getting the feedback on it. So taking advantage of all these new tooling in .NET to get the changes pushed out as quickly as possible. So my sound bites from 7 Digital focus on the flow of getting those changes out, and do that by avoiding the complex branches. They'll actually slow you down more than they will speed you up. And try to favor, aim to push out work to the customers as soon as possible. And favor fast recovery over avoiding failure. Because failure will happen whether you can code it out or not. So try and have a system that will recover as quickly as possible. Just Eat. I'm sure everyone here has heard of Just Eat, so do you need me to describe the domain? But yes, they have almost 1,200 orders placed per minute at peak time. So hugely used system. And what's quite unique about this e-commerce company is that they actually have a turnaround of between 45 minutes to an hour for every purchase, right? Not like Amazon, where you can make your order, deal with it later, maybe check the payment, maybe try a different card, send it out. 45 minutes to an hour. Everything's got to be quick. Nothing can be slow. So there's no space for error, retries, whatever. It's hosted entirely in the cloud, haha. And the system is, so there's huge amounts of communication. There's boxes in the restaurants to take the orders. Everybody's looking, tons of customers. There's just so much going on at once. Absolutely crazy. And inside the platform itself, it's quite complex. There's like internal APIs, some user services, some search APIs, the web front end. It's massive. Like there's a lot going on. And is it chaos? Each one of these teams is deploying constantly. Is it stable? So their focus for them, the reason I'm bringing this use case up is monitoring and metrics. And you guys are all familiar with Elk Stack. I've heard it like every other word this evening. So I won't mention too much about it, but we use that. This is a Microsoft .NET platform, but they've moved outside of it and using the tools from other worlds to take full advantage of it. So I suppose my takeaway from Just Eat is use what's out there. Don't just stick to what Microsoft have come up with. See what other people are using and see if you can steal it. So they've got the Elk, they've got StatsD, they've got Sarin, they've got Graphite. That's the only way to keep that crazy system. Crazy, good, lots going on. Under kind of not what's going on. The developers are on call there as well. So that's a slight difference, right? We don't have a traditional ops team at all. The devs are on call for their own products. So if they don't write good logs, they're in trouble. So they are the guys that really need to know the metrics that are happening. So this is an example of some like designing dashboards for the devs, designing dashboards for when you're on call. So instead of being really random data like 300 calls to method, blah, blah, blah. How many new card payments? How many saved card payments? Put it right there. And you learn this through trial and error as well, but it's a big focus. This is another one. I like showing this one. So this is some StatsD data, and you can see at some point we were seeing alerts like something crazy going on. This one green box decided to go nuts on its CPU. So again, metrics just for the scenarios you're going to be dealing with when you're on call. Yep, so my takeaways from Just
See what Chris
Eat.
is doing here, by the way. With the
Takeaways from
title.
Just Eat. Soundbites, takeaways, right? Collect metrics from your live systems, and you don't have to rely on the tooling that Microsoft. I know they've brought out the ASP.NET Insights, haven't tried it yet, but throw it in there, give it a go. Make the data that you're returning effective for the issue resolution. Back to Sean's stuff here, that your logs, whatever, need to be effective. Because basically too much unstructured data can be blinding in a scenario where you're fighting fires. And help your future self pinpoint those issues as quickly as possible. And these tools, which can't just have to be in the .NET ecosystem, are very helpful for that. And finally, continually review and revise any dashboards you've got for effectiveness, because stuff changes. And that's me. Just Giving.
So I'll give you two examples. One is from a company called Just Giving, who I think is the world's largest donation platform. What's interesting about Just Giving software systems is the difference between their normal load and their peak load can be absolutely enormous. So, for example, when there was a horrible case last year of someone burnt down a dog's home in Manchester or something, and then suddenly they have a big flood of donations because people want to support that. It goes viral on Twitter or whatever, and people want to support that thing. They can't predict when their peaks are going to be. Even Amazon can predict roughly when the peaks are going to be because it's around Christmas and Easter and Thanksgiving or whatever. They can't predict it at all because essentially the peaks are entirely random. So they have to have super elastic infrastructure. That's where they'd be moving. Now the majority of their stuff is on Windows, but they'd be moving to AWS, so Amazon for hosting, to give them that elasticity. The bit I wanted to pick out so this is a case study in the book, as were the previous two. This is a case study in the book. The bit I wanted to pick out was this, and this reflects something that sort of Chris mentioned as well, which is that Just Giving are running with tooling which is largely not Microsoft oriented, or sorry, not written by Microsoft. So they're using GitHub for code. They've got TeamCity doing CI builds, producing packages and so on, which are then consumed by GoCD for deployment orchestration in the middle, giving them deployment pipelines and also orchestrating other things. They're using Chef for environment configuration for all of the Windows machines, and deploying into AWS for the hosting infrastructure. So there's not a lot of kind of what you might think of as Microsoft technology now, although it's using Windows and .NET a lot. They found that they can, it didn't make sense for them. They can run a lot faster by using the best technology for the job that works with Windows. So that's working really well for them. So the parting gifts from Just Giving. Git on Windows now works really, really well. There's no excuse not to use it. Chef on Windows works really well. It's a first-class thing. And GoCD, the deployment tool, works very well with Windows. And this combination of GitHub, TeamCity, and GoCD is something that I've seen and we've introduced actually in several organizations, and it works really well. works very, very well for people in a Windows context, Windows and .NET context. There's a point here which relates to some of the stuff that Sean was saying, actually, which is that when you get to a certain size, so you can start with bring in some of the kind of logging techniques that Sean's talking about, and probably start off with some sort of cloud-hosted logging system, like Log Entries or Logly or Sematext or any of these kind of, maybe even some New Relic stuff. After a certain point, though, the amount that you're spending on pushing data down across to that logging system, or the amount you're spending on storage, is probably enough to justify running a logging system internally. So there'll be a point that you might reach, if you reach a certain scale, where it's worthwhile investing in an internal kind of log management capability. But you probably start out with a SaaS or cloud-hosted one, to be honest. But basically, these days, there are offerings that work really, really well with Windows. So there's no excuse for not getting involved in that. We're doing some work with a company that builds software for scientists. It helps them, in effect, it helps them to capture what they're doing in the laboratory, so they can bring in instrument data and combine it with readings and predictions and whatever, and bring that together in a central place, allow them to search it, this kind of thing. I can't put the name on here because it's kind of work in progress, but I wanted to share this because there's some interesting things about it. We're in the process of taking their monolithic application and splitting it into smaller pieces to allow them to deploy it more more frequently, but in a cadence which is relevant to that part of the software. They've got a web client here, but they've also got some desktop clients. So it's deployed kind of a combination of cloud-hosted and on-premise. As you can imagine, if you're working in, if any of you know anything about the kind of pharmaceutical industry, then the competition for getting the next drug or for winning the next patent in healthcare is really, really huge. So there's a lot of kind of sensitivity around where the data sits and that kind of thing. So that explains partly why stuff sits on desktop on desktop software, kind of on-premise. But what's happened is splitting out some of these pieces. There's some techniques here, even in the desktop app, which you might think is fairly monolithic. There's ways to make that, to be able to slice it vertically using kind of some sort of plugin, kind of using DLLs like plugins in effect, so that you can extend a desktop application. If you architect it in the right way, extend it. If the DLLs are there, it will provide additional functionality. If the DLLs are not present, that functionality just doesn't get loaded. So in fact, you end up being able to slice essentially a WinForms app into vertical sections, which allow then one team to take a vertical slice through what was a monolithic app and through the desktop, through the relevant part of the desktop client as well, which is quite an interesting technique. What else did I want to say from a Windows point of view?
You don't have any notes?
Yes. This is not directly related to Windows, but it's an interesting point. There are some things where the teams have decided to actually treat that as an entirely separate service. So this used to sit inside IS or whatever, but they've actually brought it out and hosting it completely separately, to the point where they don't even share the code for this with other teams. What they do is they provide a developer endpoint for other teams to connect into. So this is actually a PDF creation service. So it'll take a load of data that they've collected in the lab, it'll produce a PDF of it, but actually they've decided to run this almost as if they were a third party. So there's some interesting patterns here for if you're thinking about decomposing a big Windows system, for the patterns around how you interact with other teams. In this particular case, that's actually quite a good thing for that particular component to do, because it's very amenable to that kind of level of separation. And by basically not giving access to the code to other teams, it means that other teams are much less likely to sort of start interfering with that code, which is what the problem was with the monolithic. Because basically they had a single Subversion repository, and everyone had access to it, which kind of encouraged a monolithic design. One of the things we're doing is splitting this whole code base into a series of smaller Git repositories. If we get the splits right, if we get the splits in the right place, that's going to help enforce the right kind of component boundaries. So that's why I wanted to share on this. It's not exactly Windows specific, but if you're working on a currently big kind of IIS type app, it's worth thinking about the relationship between different teams and where you put the code in version control to help reinforce boundaries that you want to maintain. Oh, that was it. There was another thing. I'll come back to that in a second. So yeah, we've avoided Chocolatey actually right now. Although Chocolatey, you can make it work, and actually the Just Giving team have found that Chocolatey does work well for them. We've not found it working so well for us, partly because we actually need to do the deployment onto client systems which we don't own ourselves. So actually, in that case, we're still using MSIs. We're using each component has its own MSI installer, and then we'll create a wrapper which can install, say, 6 of them or 10 of them or whatever. So you can create a new wrapper installer without rebuilding the underlying installers. And that works fairly well. So we talked about splitting the code base on the domain boundaries. Detecting configuration drift is an interesting one, because what the teams are struggling with, the fact that in different environments we're kind of somehow getting out of sync. People were going on and changing configuration in the test environment or the QA environment. So there are tools now that, again, first-class support on Windows that easily allow us to detect configuration drift between one state and the next. We'll have a look at that, I think, in a minute. This installation experience has been quite interesting. They like logging as a feature. This is related in that there was very little effort put into the installation of the software. It goes on-premise to client systems. And what they were finding was that sysadmins or ops people were unpacking the installers and repackaging them because they didn't trust them. And so, to my mind, that really smells like something's really wrong. So it was not. I think they were not using a normal MSI. They were using some weird, I don't know what it was, some Ruby thing. I don't know. It was like a cross-platform thing, trying to get cross-platform Windows and Linux they had to support. But actually, just as with logging, you'd say, as an ops person, I need to find out when a certain thing happens from the log. Why not, as a sysadmin or as an ops person, when I'm installing this thing, the experience should be natural. It should feel normal to me to install this thing. I should be able to trust it. I shouldn't feel the need to unpack it and repackage it later on. So we're working on that installation experience as a feature with user stories for the ops people.
It's like I said, it's probably true for most everything infrastructure related. I was
just
ranting about logging. But definitely installation
absolutely.
is a feature.
Yep.
Upgrading is a feature.
Yep.
Backups and restores are a feature. All features, yeah, for sure.
And you can write user stories which are as a sysadmin, I expect X, Y, Z so that I can do it. It's a normal user story. It's not something weird. It fits totally. So that was that recommendation. Oh, these are yours now.
Yeah. So repeating ourselves, but these are the takeaway recommendations or sound bites. The continual flow of changes that can be achieved in a Windows and .NET system that's usually technology agnostic, more people than anything else. Again, collecting effective metrics from the live systems, and I stress the word effective. We go back to Sean here and his making sure it all makes sense, get your user stories, whatever. And yes, branch code with caution. Sometimes branches are needed, but again, caution, they can actually stilt the flow, and here's a branch with caution, right? We prefer the use of Git not because of its ability to handle branches, which is lovely and all that, but relatively just developer fun and unnecessary. But yeah, over SVN and
just stop using Team Foundation version control, seriously. Yeah. If you're using it still, just stop using it, because it's absolutely killing your productivity, I guarantee it. And every single organization I've been into in the last 2 years that's using Team Foundation version control is suffering hugely, and they don't know it. So if you're using it, just use something else, anything else.
Yeah, and these are already supported by Microsoft. So if anyone is worried that, oh my God, it's not Microsoft, they are supported on Azure, they're supported by the tool, by Visual Studio, whatever. It's not Linux going crazy or anything. It's all supported.
Microsoft is bad at version control.
Does seem that way.
Microsoft knows Microsoft is bad at version control.
Now they support alternatives, so yeah, there's no excuse not to use it.
So when we were writing the book, we got the book reviewed by the Azure team in the US, by the Visual Studio team in the US, by the Visual Studio team in the UK, and the bits of the book where we said Team Foundation version control is horrible, don't use it, there was no comment whatsoever about that. They were totally happy with that stuff. Yes. That should tell you all you need to know, right?
So we have got in Just Eat immutable-ish infrastructure with Windows, but again, the minimal kind of size is roughly around 40 gig, unfortunately. So it's difficult, but not impossible, and it does have a bit of a lag in startup time when after your images come up, around 20 minutes. So be aware of this, but you can do it, and just And I think cores, when it comes out, Windows Core will be a lot friendlier. You'll have something more like this little guy than this guy up here. So yeah, try your clicker. Yay, these are yours.
So yeah, you use NuGet for internal dependencies. And when I say internal dependencies, I mean if you've got one team over here building one library or service, another team over here consuming it, this thing should be packaged as a NuGet package. That should be consumed by these people, not via the old style kind of cross-project, cross-solution dependencies. That's just not the way to do this stuff. Pretty much everything on in the .NET Windows world now supports NuGet feeds of one form or another. So there's quite a lot of traction there now.
You can even get TeamCity to generate and host them if you don't want to go down the whole route. I mean, it's there from the start.
It's not ideal. There's lots of stuff that could be improved with it, but it's a much better way of doing things than cross-project dependencies at the solution file level. Think about using a proper artifact repository if you're doing anything of an interesting scale. So Artifactory Nexus, they all support NuGet feed as a specific thing, but they'll also support RPMs or Node, NPM, all sorts of other package formats, and they allow you to do loads of cool stuff with metadata and this kind of thing. One of those things where once you've tried it, you'll never want to do without it, but so it's worthwhile trying out a proper package repository, artifact repository. And also it's worthwhile bearing in mind that the relationship between solution files and project files in the Visual Studio sense can really affect how well you can kind of do continuous integration, certainly, and also actually by extension continuous delivery. So we've got some rules in the book, but typically it's kind of one solution file per sort of component or thing that you build, and certainly not sharing projects between solutions. Now it might feel a bit strange, but it's the right way to do it. It makes things a lot more effective. So yeah, there's our package repository, all nice and neat and traceable and what have you. The right kind of metadata on the labels and so on. So the database is an interesting area. There are tools in the Windows space, particularly for SQL Server, but not just SQL Server, Oracle and MySQL and the rest, Postgres and so on as well, that help us to automate a lot of database changes. We should be doing this now. There's no excuse for not doing it. There's enough that works on Windows to get a lot of good value out of these tools. Which tool you pick depends on lots of things, but mostly it depends on whether your changes are driven from developers or whether the changes are in effect driven from DBAs or database administrators, or the extent to which database administrators have a strong role in kind of shaping what those changes are. And that should shape how you kind of pick which set of tools. And we cover that in the book as well. But this relationship between devs and DBAs is a really tricky one, particularly if you've got a big central monolithic database. So don't ignore that aspect. Work out how to deal with it. Work out the implication of kind of teams having different views of what the database is for and how it should change and that kind of thing. And that will help you be able to go more quickly. And when you're doing patch management with Windows updates and that kind of thing, this stuff needs testing in upstream environments. I mean, kind of patch management testing is relatively well understood, but a lot of places that I've seen just roll them out in production or have them rolled out in production by some kind of IT ops people and don't really test them in upstream environments. But that's not really going to fly because we don't get early visibility of potential problems that could completely cripple our software. So that stuff, because we can automate the VMs and stuff now and automate the testing of these patches, there's no excuse not to do it in upstream environments. So here's our big database, and we've got developers thinking it's one thing, and ops people or DBAs thinking it's something else. So we need to get a kind of sensible view of what our database is for and how we should evolve it and where the changes should be driven from. What else have we got? Some practical stuff then on the Windows side. So rather than having a single centralized Active Directory administration, devolve some AD administration down to smaller groups so they can look after things themselves. We can automate things like machines joining and leaving the domain. And so rather than there being a kind of IT support or sysadmin type bottleneck for lots of these kind of administration tasks, push that down into, say, product teams or into smaller platform teams where they can automate some of this stuff. Make friends with Linux. Like some of the best tools definitely run on Linux, like Chris said. Just make friends, it's not that hard. You know, we're using PowerShell for the command line, we should be these days, rather than click, click, click on Windows. So we can learn a bit of Bash and get familiar with managing a few Linux boxes too for some of these tools that Chris mentioned. There's one particular tool that we really like, which is called UpGuard. It used to be called ScriptRock. It's now called UpGuard. Again, native on Windows. And you drop the agent onto different machines. It will then monitor the configuration across different machines, but also across different points in time on the same machine, and report back and allow you to kind of audit the configuration changes. And it does a really nice visualization of the changes too. This kind of tooling, and there are other tools there as well, but this particular one is really nice on the Windows side. It's kind of belt and braces because we're automating stuff, we're pushing new changes in configuration down. This is a kind of safeguard.
It's probably a learning tool as well as you move over.
It is a learning tool as well, exactly. It gives us an extra safety net for making changes. So there's our configuration drifting away from us, so UpGuard can help us deal with that.
Yeah, so as Business Cat says, there are no excuses for doing effective continuous delivery with Windows and .NET in 2016 now. So go.
So that's it. Go and download the book and give it to your friends and colleagues, or just laugh at how long it's taken Windows to get to this point. But that's fine too. That's it. Any questions?
Yeah, and I looked at the summary, and I want to ask. What list of tools do you have in a book? Like, of course, TeamCity, Octopus, PartnerNet, Bamboo.
So we cover version control stuff. We cover continuous integration tooling. Cover tools for dealing with deployment pipelines, database change automation.
Do you want?
Particular tools for CI/CD, Octopus, Upveyor.
Yes. Not that last one. I've not heard of that one.
Yeah. All these. Well, a lot of these kind of tools.
But they're covered lightly. It is a short book, it's an introductory book, so it's more so you can see what's out there more than anything else. So, yeah.
There are a few tools which.
Yeah, and we've covered kind of.
Not a lot of people are not familiar with that.
That's true.
It's a replacement of MS Build.
Okay. That one's a new one to me. Okay. Cool. Look into that one. Thanks. Any other questions?
Anything else?
This is kind of a non-technical question. Obviously, having written the first continuous delivery with Windows, but did you take much inspiration from Dave Farley's original?
He wrote the foreword for us. In fact, if we go along, we thank him for writing the foreword. So he's actually read the book for us, and he sees it as a kind of like a small addendum, effectively, like a little Windows-specific update. So yes.
So do you know Dave quite well?
You know him more than I do.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
When Dave Farley and Jez were writing the original book, Continuous Delivery 2010, you couldn't do this stuff on Windows, right? So part of the motivation for me and Chris writing this book was it's kind of updating that book, if you like a little addendum or appendix for what they could have written had all this stuff been there back in 2010.
Yeah.
Also what?
Dave lives on Macs. Okay. Yeah. Cool. Anything else, or do you want to go back to your beer and pizzas? Go ahead.
You mentioned Team City. What about using Visual Studio Online?
I haven't actually used it, but I guess if you're in a team that's new to something, I would definitely take a look. Yeah.
That's what we're using at the moment.
How's it going?
Team City, not that great.
Oh dear.
Are you
changed the name, I guess.
so, say it again.
I think they changed the name, I guess.
Yeah, yes.
Visual Studio Team
Yeah.
Services, I guess.
Yeah.
So I think one of the limitations that so we're about to start using it another client, but one of the limitations I saw for the online, this is the online Visual Studio build system, which sort of is like TFS but online and a lot better, is that the build agents that you get in the cloud are fairly limited. I think you can't customize them very much. Is that right? And you still, if you want heavy customization, you've got to use your own build agent that you run yourself. Is it still like that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that might be one gotcha if anyone's thinking about using that. So if it's a fairly simple standard console application or web app, I think MVC web app it supports, services, REST services, then it'll support it out of the box. If you're doing anything a bit more funky or you need some additional stuff installed, you'll have to kind of have your own build agent in addition to the stuff in the cloud. But it can, Visual Studio Online can push stuff to a build agent that you run yourself, I believe. And so you can kind of mix and match like a hybrid thing.
You can write extensions for the one which is in the cloud. So what's happening? Unless you need something to install, you can't do that, of course. You need your local. But if you need some kind of funky scripts, you can either write scripts or write some extensions.
Okay, so it needs a little bit more love, but then so does making a build agent, I guess, if you're doing it on Team City.
So the really naive comment is that if you think your choice of tool is holding you back, try the other tool and see if everything gets a lot easier. There are demos out there for Team City, and I'm sure you can still get 30 days. I know that's twice as much work, which is a naive comment, but tooling can sometimes, the wrong tooling can sometimes hold you back quite a bit. So if you're not sure, it might be worth, investing a week's worth of
Sadly, we don't
playtime or
have a
something.
choice. We're stuck with Visual Studio Online.
Well, I mean, managers are not always as naive and insane as you think they are. And if you can go with them and say, yes, it costs money, but here's how much time, here's how much money in time form it'll save you. That's what I've just described there is the essence of consulting. It's just, convincing people that if they spend this money, they'll save this much more money. And it's a tricky thing, but sometimes it's the right thing.
Adding to that, Matthew mentioned using Microsoft's source control system and how it wastes a lot of time and you just won't see it.
The previous versions.
The previous versions, to like.
Using tools that aren't quite right for the job, or not having some StatsD or logging platform, or just having a workflow which is pretty inefficient, can cost you not really money, but lots and lots of time. And people who have not been hopping around companies just will not see it. It's just the way things are. It's a bit sad.
Yeah, I think the one thing, I totally agree. And I think the one thing I'd just, anyone who's involved in building tooling and things for, or configuring tooling for continuous delivery in general, but particularly on Windows, is to reflect on how many stages there are between your code commit and that stuff getting out there. If the tooling you're using is forcing you to test in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different environments before it hits your live or production environment, is that the right set of tooling? Probably not, because we ought to be able to set things up so that we can have a very short journey between code commit and live if we need it, if we want it, for example, for bug fixing and for small changes that we know are low risk. So when you're evaluating tooling, just bear that stuff in mind.
And do be aware that continuous delivery, it is true that continuous delivery places radically different demands on your tooling than other kinds of delivery.
Yes.
It's not a small difference, and so it can call for radically different tools that they sort of do the same thing, but they do it in very different ways. Different feature requirements.
But I guess we're talking to the choir here on that one. Cool.
Any more questions?
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Thanks very
and,
much.
You'll find it online.